Hello everyone. In this video I'd like to talk about drawing. In second grade, drawing is a great opportunity for the students to develop an imitation for beauty, as well as to meet their need for increased techniques, the ability to draw what they see in their minds a little bit more than they would otherwise. Drawing becomes a part of what we do almost every day in main lesson. The structure of our main lesson book work almost always includes writing or math and some kind of drawing. And those drawing activities generally can be placed into one of three different categories. The first is free rendering. Free rendering is the kind of drawing that happens when you might say to a child, draw what you think that story might have been about. There are no parameters or expectations, and the child might draw in styles that are very different than what you might have shown them in class, and might draw content that isn't even necessarily a part of the story. It's a great way for children to develop their own confidence in their imagination. It's also a nice complement to the kind of child writing that is a good part of language development. The second kind of drawing is an imitative drawing, not based on a guided technique, but based on something that they see. This is a way for them to take the kinds of techniques that you've been showing them in class and try to apply them on their own. And it's the kind of drawing that might happen if you've prepared a blackboard drawing in advance, or if you have an example drawing that you're showing them in a main lesson book or somewhere else, and then asking them to figure out the steps on their own. This is a great challenge for second graders. They may very well ask you for a little bit of guidance and steps, but it's a really good way for you to turn that question back to them to say, well, where do you think I may have started on this drawing? How would you try and put those colors together? What step do you think might happen next? And the best way to help support them in being able to answer those questions is to have given them a good number of guided drawings as well. In general, in my classes, a free rendering drawing might happen every week or two, one time in main lesson every week or two, and often in conjunction with a main lesson book writing page with a large amount of writing. So with all of that thinking activity, the self-expression would be a balance. The second type of drawing from an example, would happen maybe 2 times per week, which gives them the opportunity to try and apply their skills. And then that last type of drawing, the guided drawing, is something that I would do with the other 2 days per week, and maybe 3 days on a week where there wasn't a free rendering drawing. That way, each day they're being led through steps of a drawing so that they can start to learn how to do it, follow the examples that you're giving them, and become more confident in what they're able to do. One step that I often would leave at the end of a guided drawing is the opportunity for them to add details on their own once they have finished. And that gives them a feeling of making it really their own drawing, but after they've followed all of the steps that you've introduced. Now, there are a few things to keep in mind that I'll show you in the example here in a moment, but one thing is to always be working in drawings from color toward line. Frequently, we see in children's drawings that they start by drawing an outline and then want to color it in, this coloring book style, or what I often refer to with my class as drawing cartoons. It's a fine way to work, but it's also a very difficult way to develop drawing techniques and skills, the way the second grader really enjoys being able to do it. Primarily because once those lines are made, they are very difficult to overcome. And starting again or trying a second time is something that I strongly discourage in second graders. Learning to improve our work, accept the mistakes we've made, and find a way to correct them, that's a different kind of learning process that I encourage all the time. And drawing is a really good opportunity for that. So by not working in line, it means that we have to create form by where colors meet. And this was something that Steiner had a lot to say about finding line where 2 colors come together. It's a great technique to be able to build up. It lends itself well to block crayon drawings. It helps to also work at keeping the figures large on the page, which is something that you want to encourage with your second graders. And finally, it allows you to work from the background to the foreground, starting with the set and setting around the people or the characters in the story or whatever the topic of the drawing is, and then working more and more towards the details. This also really asks the children to work in a different way of thinking. Rather than focusing on one specific goal for their drawing, to draw, for example, the grasshopper, they're thinking about the scene from the story that they want to capture, thinking about where will the grasshopper be? Who else might be there? Where could this picture be taking place? All give them a chance to create a full and vivid imagination before beginning to commit to any marks on paper. So with those kinds of things in mind, they also offer you the opportunity to build up some drawing techniques as well as art concepts that they'll be using later in class. Let's work on an example drawing. I'll show you what some of those might look like. In working on a drawing with a class, there are a few things to keep in mind. First of all, I would always be working from a story that they've heard. So imagining that 2 days ago, they heard the story of the grasshopper and the ant. Then the next day, they would have recalled it, of course. And then on the third day, we're working on a drawing. We would have probably written something in our main lesson book already, and then I'd be giving a guided drawing for that as well. So I would always start in class by beginning with a border. Starting with a border helps the child to orient themselves in space. It also gives that continuing practice of eye tracking from left to right, top to bottom, and it gives a little bit of time as well for you to be thinking. So starting off, we would say, and working with block crayons, I established some vocabulary in first grade that I used a lot by talking about the sides of the crayon in different ways. We talk about the sides of the crayon as the Papa Bear side, the Mama Bear side, and the Baby Bear side. Now, if I were to go back and do this again, I think I would degender those terms and be just talking about the small side, the medium side, and the large side. But you could choose any kind of terminology that you think works best for your class. I do establish which side we'd like to use, in this case the medium side, working from left to right, and top to bottom. And in this way, they've created a space that they could be working in. Now, one thing that I do with my class often in second grade is to start to talk about different techniques that they might use. Different levels of pressure are important. So for the border, they've pressed one way, but I might start with the next step and say, so we'll start with a sky, with a light, large side, and we're using it with even pressure, trying not to leave too much of any kind of line. Really just enough that they can start to find it. You can barely see that color, and learning that they're creating something that doesn't have to be made with strong forms is an important skill for building up later techniques. Then starting with a little bit of green in the grass. And again, I'm starting very lightly. I might say to the second grade that I want to be sure to start very lightly so that I can make my grasshopper show up. If I've drawn too dark for the ground, the grasshopper will be very hard to show. But I've decided that before I draw my grasshopper or my ant, who are both going to be in the drawing, I'd like there to be a place for the grasshopper to sit. So I'm going to put a tree here on the left-hand side. Now, when I'm drawing things, I often try to mimic the way in which that thing grows in nature, as well as trying to mimic its form. So I might start with a brown here at the ground, drawing from the ground up. So I'm starting with a general form. And I would have introduced in second grade this idea that you might turn a crayon and lift it to create a different mark. That way they're not always making these solid certain sizes, but they're learning that they can turn their hands. This is a fine motor activity that also lets them build up some different appearances in their drawings, which second graders love to be able to find different ways to make things look nice. I would have also probably shown them by this point how to press harder on one side of the crayon, which gives a more distinct outline and also gives a feeling of shading. They love that idea that they can bring that in. And you can start that just in general form and then build it up a little bit later with details and other colors in the later points. Now, in the story, I would ask the class, well, when in the year is the story taking place? And they might talk about which part of it they would like to do. I'd say, well, I'd like to draw the grasshopper watching the ant work while the grasshopper is resting underneath the tree. What time of year would that be? Well, it would be in the summer. So what would the tree look like? Well, it would have foliage. So we'll add a little bit of foliage, and building that in, again, they may want to start drawing leaves, but drawing their attention to the fact that we can use our block crayons first to just find a general place where the foliage will be. Again, using that technique of pressing harder, in this case with the thumb, to be able to form those harder edges. But not enough, even here, that might have been a little too much. Not enough to really make lines, but just enough to form an impression. Then I'm ready to start putting my characters into the drawing. Now, any figure that I draw with the second grade class, I would almost always start by saying, let's find the light inside this character first, and we'll find that person with yellow. Now, that really works in two ways. On the one hand, I think it helps them to understand this greater presence of every character. Second, it helps them in a practical sense to be able to put things in place, but move them if they need to. So by starting with yellow, I'm going to start with the grasshopper, and I'd say, well, grasshoppers, like other insects, will have 3 different parts to their bodies. So I'll put the grasshopper's head here, lightly with yellow, shading to find the space, not trying to make any kind of outline at this point. And as with most things in second grade, I'll make that a little bigger. Then the thorax of the grasshopper is slightly larger than the head, with the abdomen of the grasshopper being quite large, and in this case, in a reclining position. Now you can see that I do wind up with some slight lines in the course of doing this, but the idea of having the children understand that you're working in spaces and not with outlines is really the goal here. Now, at this point, I would ask them to stop and look at the proportion of where things are, looking at the size of their grasshopper in relationship to the page, so that they're not drawing a little teeny tiny thing that they can't find details in, and they haven't drawn a grasshopper that's so large that it takes over the page. They might bring something up about how my grasshopper is almost as tall as my tree, and I would enjoy that as a conversation. How could a grasshopper be as big as a tree? Well, perhaps it's not a tree, but some other type of plant that looks that way. The next thing that I would do is to find where the ant is going to be. So before I'm adding any details, I'm asking them to leave that bee for a moment and instead focus on an ant. And my ant will be headed this direction. I think I'll start with its head here, with its thorax there, abdomen there. Now, in this way, by working on the entire drawing first, they're being asked to work from the whole to the parts. They're having to think about everything before focusing on one specific detail. And that constant in and out of their focus is really helpful to learning flexible thinking. So the next thing I would do is to start to find a little bit more color. So I'm thinking about green for my grasshopper. And at this point, I'm really needing to be sure that I'm happy with where and how big the parts of it are. So I add, again, just a light layer of color first. This idea of building up layers is something that's really important to bring into second grade drawing. They understand it and can apply it, but it develops a different kind of patience in their work. And by doing that, they'll start to learn to be able to adjust while they're drawing better and better as they go. So by creating that, I have now formed where the grasshopper is going to be. I can start to think about a little bit more detail once I've put in a little more detail in my ant as well. And I'm going to start the ant actually with some blue. Now, in my second grade class, someone likely would have said, but aren't ants black? I'd like to have my ant with black. And my answer would likely be, well, of course, I'm going to use some as well, but as I would have discussed with them earlier, the darker the color, the harder it is to adjust. And so by working from lighter colors to those with more pigment, it allows us to really kind of build up what the character looks like, what the figure looks like in a way that can constantly be corrected. So now that I have their body parts in place, now I can start with some limbs, because clearly these look more like caterpillars than they do any other kind of bug. And at this point, I would start to turn to stick crayons. So they've done the layout. They may come back with block crayons a little bit later, but I would probably start at this point in time with some stick crayons, with really trying to find where will the leg of this grasshopper be. And at this stage, they're really enjoying being able to use a stick crayon to find where those things are. We might talk about the texture of those legs, about the shape that they might take, but not overly into detail. The idea here is not a science lesson about grasshoppers, but rather a drawing lesson about a story. I do use techniques like this of coming behind and having things that are behind other areas. And third grade or second graders really enjoy being able to find how to create what they'll call making it look 3D. And showing them that I go here and I know where my leg is going to go, but I just pick it up again there. Theirs likely won't look like yours, but by demonstrating some of these techniques in advance, it gives them something to aspire to. Now, if you're someone who has a harder time with this kind of drawing, give yourself the time to practice and also be willing to simplify as much as you would like. Making simple drawings and being able to talk about your process with your class is the most important part. Being able to demonstrate a beautiful drawing is less important than showing them and telling them about how you are thinking about creating something like this. And so by doing that, they'll start to see that they can learn and grow. For those of you who are excellent artists, you will have in some ways a harder time of this, because explaining where and why you're making those choices and slowing it down is hard. For those who are maybe don't consider themselves great artists yet, that is a really great thing in the second grade, because allowing them to see you work at trying to figure things out while also talking through your process will really model for them the kind of learning that you want them to do. So whatever kind of artist you are, give yourself the freedom to be able to explore it, laugh about it with your class. The one thing I would really encourage is that at no point in time do you put yourself down in front of them or say things like, "I'm not a good artist." We want the second graders to be able to see themselves as changing, as constantly evolving. And it's really hard to do that if they hear adults talk about themselves as fixed things. If they think that once that you either are an artist or you're not an artist, then when it's hard, they may decide, it's hard, I'm not an artist, I don't need to try anymore. And we don't want them to bring that attitude into anything that they do. So by bringing now these first places of lines, I would also start to change some colors. And by bringing other colors, I would talk to the class about using darker colors to start to separate the figures from the ground by creating shadow. And using a stick crayon, not to create lines, but rather to create shading, is a great opportunity for the second grade student. You don't need a lot of it, but it helps them to start to see where that goes. Now, I don't in the second grade introduce techniques like cross hatching. I really keep it as just shading with block crayon, adding in some shading with stick crayon, and trying to avoid line drawing. And in that way, they can really kind of build some of these up on their own. Now I'm at a point where I'm ready to add in a little bit more detail and color. So I'm going to start to add in some of that black into the ant and allowing them to build up this idea of coloring and drawing without showing their lines. I talk about that in second grade as avoiding scribbles. That of course we expect younger children to have lots of scribbles in their work, and if they have younger siblings, they may very well see that they draw with scribbles that look like a pile of tangles. But that we, as second graders, can start to really control our drawing so that we can create a nice smooth shading, but we can also go back and add in some more stronger lines that would allow us to really make some parts of it stand out. Now that's only possible if you start fairly light and then work up to making greater detail. They'll struggle with this. Some children will be really upset by it. They'll want a lot of help, but little by little, they'll develop a greater and greater patience with themselves and a greater and greater ability to be able to do it. Well, now I have what are the starts of some animals, but I'm going to need a big bag, and I didn't really leave space. Now, this is a great opportunity where I might say to the class, now you can see that I was not thinking ahead. I wasn't thinking about what my drawing would be, and now I have these legs in the middle of my bag, and really, if a bag was on the ant's back, we wouldn't be able to see those legs on the other side. So what can we do about it? We can add in some depth, but I might not be able to get rid of all of it, and that's okay. And that's the kind of thing that I try and do on a regular basis with my class, is to show them some mistakes and let those mistakes be all right. Now, I might tell them I can try and mix some of that in to make it into the wrinkles. I can pick up the blue and the black that were in the ant so that the color of the bag starts to match, so that we don't see this part of the back. But I don't want to make my bag into all black, so I'll keep that light and let there be some places where there's nothing in there. Similarly, perhaps I've forgotten that the violin, the fiddle that I'd like my grasshopper to be playing, would be over its arm, but that's all right. It's all about the learning. And by letting them see some of those mistakes, see things that we are doing and how we're adjusting, how we're trying to cover things a little bit, but also really modeling, leaving those lines until last, leaving those details to the end, it really helps them to have greater flexibility with themselves. Now, there's a few things that I would do to be able to also work at further finishing this before I would let them add details on their own. One thing is that I always ask them to try and ground their figures. The place where an object meets the ground, and purple block crayons are great for this. This is where I really have them practice that skill of pressing harder on one edge, is by using a little purple, sometimes black, sometimes just the color that's there, but a little bit darker, and finding all of the places where the figure meets the ground. Now, it might not be everywhere. Here, underneath the ant, perhaps its body is a little bit more up in the air, so I might not do that. But here, especially where the grasshopper is sitting on the ground, there would be quite a lot of shadow. So by adding that in, and now I would ask them to go back and darken in the background now that we know where those figures are going to be. And they can do this, again, we're back to a block crayon, but they can do this really right over a lot of the drawing. If they've been careful to add up those layers, then adding color on top of the layers that's there won't ruin the drawing that they're doing. This also works in that hole to the parts and then back out to the hole, so that they're really seeing their drawing as an ongoing process where they're working with the whole composition and not simply working on one little piece at a time. We want them to really get that sense of perspective. And right about this point, if I were drawing in class, I would say, I'm going to finish up with mine. You may go ahead and now work on your drawing. And if there are other details that you would like to add, you may. Some details that I might suggest would be things like antenna for the different insects, another set of limbs for the grasshopper, who would of course have 6 legs, not 4. Perhaps there will be a path that the ant is walking on, or some more color brought into the tree. But one way or the other, see what you might be able to do to make this drawing really your best. I hope that you've enjoyed this, and I hope that this is a helpful drawing. This is something that I might be doing in the second or third month of school, probably later part of the first block of fable stories. So I hope that you enjoy.